Magnus Carlsen had the white pieces today in Game 4 of the World Chess Championship, and one of the big questions was what would he play as his first move? Would he go in for another Catalan? Well, he opened up with pawn to e4. Not so unusual, he does like to dabble with all sorts of openings, but here was the big surprise. So Jan went pawn to e5, we had knight to f3, and now Jan responded by playing the Petrov defense, also known as the Russian game. An unusual choice for Jan because he doesn't play this, he's never played this before at the top level really, so this took a lot of people by surprise. So Magnus jumped in and took the pawn, we had pawn to d6, the knight retreated, and now black chopped in the middle, all standard theory, and this was the first interesting moment. So one of the most common moves for super GMs here is to play knight to c3, to play for an advantage and go in for some of the sharper lines, but instead of this, Magnus goes for pawn to d4, an indication that he doesn't want to get into Jan's deep preparation which he's probably put together. So Jan now plays pawn to d5, we had bishop to d3 from Magnus, bishop to d6 from Jan, castles, castles, pawn to c4, pawn to c6 bolstering the centre, rook to e1 now, and bishop to f5. So this is quite a standard position, been seen many times. Black is aiming to keep this knight on e4 and white is trying to undermine it and play against these light squares here. And we see that in Magnus's next move, which is queen to b3, so it instantly pressures here and also on the b7 pawn. Now there's different ways for black to play here. You can get quite tactical and go knight a6, but Magnus plays queen to d7 instead, just defending that pawn and also the bishop here on f5. And that means that after Magnus plays knight to c3 developing, Jan can now chop that knight off, and after the bishop recaptures here, the queen can take back. And this is an interesting moment. So Jan chose to take the knight on c3 with the pawn. Note that you don't want to take with the queen because then black could take here and you're suddenly saddled with this isolated queen's pawn, which you don't want. So that's why Jan took back with the pawn. But one other option he had was to jump in and take this pawn on b7, hitting the unprotected rook. Now there's some really sharp lines here, so for example Magnus could have then played knight to e4, and after queen takes, queen d7. Yes, black is down in exchange, but is this queen getting trapped? It's very tactical and very sharp, so won't go in for all of that. But coming back to this position here, Magnus didn't do this, he preferred to stay solid and he doesn't want to walk into Jan's prep. So he recaptured the knight with the pawn, Jan played b6 to now defend that weakness, and Magnus took in the centre and we had a recapture. So black has this isolated pawn, it's a weak pawn that white will be trying to play against, but in compensation for that, white has this backward c3 pawn which black can quickly play against. So it's a dynamic position and almost equality has been reached here. Magnus plays queen b5, so he does still have some pressure, but after queen d7 to challenge the queen, note that white can't take here, or we have a common tactic, bishop takes on h2 check, uncovering this attack on the queen and picking up the white queen. So Magnus actually plays pawn to a4 here. He could have considered taking and after knight recaptures then going a4 to try and undermine the structure like this, but perhaps he felt that this was helping Jan develop the knight too easily, and so that's why he didn't go for this. Instead he chose to play a4 immediately, and this looks nice because after black recaptures, which is kind of forced because otherwise where are you developing the b8 knight to, Magnus then recaptures and we can see he's got this nice bind with this pawn, but perhaps he'd overlooked Jan's move here. Jan played quite quickly pawn to a5, a really nice freeing move, just coming straight past this pawn, and Magnus doesn't really want to take en passant, or otherwise the knight can recapture, and again you're really helping black develop his pieces. This knight can come back to c7 where it defends d5, it could even then look to come into e6 or into b5 where it pressures c3, so it's just not really what you want as white when you're playing for advantage. So instead here, after pawn to a5, Magnus actually plays a really interesting move now. So he plays knight out to h4 here. A strange looking move because you're putting the knight on the edge of the board, and after g6 there's a real question about where is that knight actually going. But here's Magnus's follow-up, pawn to g4. And what he's aiming to do here is reroute the knight into g2 and then either e3 or f4, where it then looks at this sensitive d5 pawn, which we note is weak. So it's a really nice knight maneuver and quite a deep positional idea from Magnus here. Jan now develops his knight into d7. He's looking to come into f6 and then e4 in the long run. We now have knight to g2 from Magnus, continuing with the plan. We had rook f to c8, eyeing up this pawn, and again it was notable how quickly Jan played this move, so it shows how well prepared he was in this position. He knew which rook to move there, and he knew how to generate counterplay. We had bishop to f4 now from Magnus, and again this makes a lot of positional sense. If you go with the knight, then black can chop, and after we recapture, you can no longer attack this pawn so easily, and the knight is a better minor piece. And if you put the knight on e3, well, now you block your bishop. So this is why Magnus played bishop to f4, and Jan is basically forced to capture here or else risk being worse. Knight recaptures, hitting this pawn, and now Jan doesn't play knight f6 to defend or else he gets hit with g5, so instead he jumps in and takes on c3. Magnus captures on d5, and now the rook comes into d3. Jan could have considered rook to b3, hitting this pawn, although even if he then takes that pawn, we note that there's a knight fork coming on c7 in that position, so I think he played in the right way here. He ducked in behind this d pawn, which could also get very dangerous in future, we note, so it makes sense for the rook to be behind it. Magnus now played rook into e7, attacking this knight. The knight dropped back to f8, looking to come back to e6, and this is basically the only journey it had. And now Magnus checks on this f6 square, which has just been vacated by that knight. King into g7, knight back to e8. So Magnus could have actually forced the draw here, but you know, he's white. He wants to press. You don't want to just give your opponent easy draws and show that you're not willing to fight, especially in a World Championship match. So Jan drops the king back, and now Magnus goes pawn to d5. And we don't take that pawn because otherwise we're running into knight f6 with this nice fork. So instead, Jan does exactly what he should do, which is play pawn to a4. He starts generating counterplay of his own. We have knight into f6 now, king to g7, pawn to g5, solidifying that knight. Pawn to a3 now from Jan. Now knight to e8 from Magnus, checking the king. King to g8, knight hops back. King to g7, knight comes back. And actually we saw a repetition of moves in this position. And you can't take with the rook or you run into this same fork. But after d6, instead Jan could have played rook to d8, and even with the pawn getting to d7, because these pieces are arranged so well defensively with the rook behind, actually white can't really make progress. And Magnus had spent a lot of time here, so he could have even been risking being worse if he wasn't careful. So a great Petrov from Jan, and this might really put Magnus off from playing e4 in future, so we'll see what he plays on move 1 in the next game. If you've enjoyed this video and want to see more, then click here to subscribe, and to see more Carlsen games, click here. Thanks very much for watching, and see you again soon.